We're in chapter 1 of How to Steal a Dragon Sword, and Hiccup is sleeping halfway up this enormous cliff. Look at that huge cliff, and it's so big he's having to sleep halfway up in his hammock because they can't climb it in one day. And he's just spotted coming towards them, advancing, dark, shadowy shape slowly flying towards them over the gorge of the Thunderbolt of Thor. They were too far away for him to identify which types of dragons they were exactly, but there was something nightmarish about their wings, and he knew them deep in his soul. When a young rabbit spots a hawk circling above it may never have seen such a creature before, but there is some ancestral memory that tells it to be afraid, to leap in great panicky bounds to the safety of the burrow. So it was with these dragons. It was not, of course, that Hiccup had never seen dragons before. He lived in a world full of the creatures, both wild and domesticated. But what was different about these dragons was their behaviour. There were a number of different species, and they were acting as if they were part of a hunting party. Oh dear. And dragon species did not generally join together to hunt humans. Maybe they had done once long ago, but for as long as the old ones could remember, they did not hunt humans. A wild dragon would eat you, of course, if you happened to cross its path, and it was hungry. But there was no organised hunting of the human, as perhaps there had been way in the past. Hiccup's scalp prickled all over with fear, as if he was being climbed all over by black beetles. He strained so hard to hear into that darkness that it was as if his ears were growing outwards. And somehow above the whir of the wind he could just hear a truly terrifying noise, a savage hiss in Dragonese, but nastier than he had ever heard Dragonese spoken. It was so cold with hatred. There was something scarily trance-like about the way the words were spat out, so faint he could barely catch them, but perhaps it was better if he could not hear them after all. Make red your claws with human blood, obliterate the human filth, torch the humans like a wood. The rebellion is coming. Closer, closer flew the advancing dragons, heading straight for the cliff where the hammocks perched. Hiccup craned his neck even further upwards. About 60 feet above him were the hammocks of the other young warriors of the tribes of the archipelago. Now you can see there they are. They're on the cliff, and that's his hammock. That's Fishlegs' hammock, and that's Windwalker sleeping there just out of... Oh, I don't think I'd sleep well halfway up a cliff myself. I don't know about you. Anyway, yes, not just like his home. So he's got the other ones are all a bit further up. They were half an hour's climbing ahead of Fishlegs and Hiccup, and while Fishlegs and Hiccup's hammocks were made out of brown patched blankets, theirs were made out of old ship's sails. The gaudy patterns of these sails, such as red and white stripes or blue and gold diamonds, made them stick out against the cliff like a flamingo sitting in a bog. The mysterious dragons were heading straight towards them. Hiccup could see what they were now. He recognised them from their wing patterns. They were a mixture of some of the nastiest types of dragons in the archipelago. Razor wings and tongue twisters and doldrums and vampire ghoul deaths. I've got to warn the others, thought Hiccup, and he opened his mouth to shout, but terror seemed to have strangled his vocal cords like it does in your worst nightmares. Squeak! Panted Hiccup, faintly. Squeak, squeak, squeak! That wasn't going to do much good. And then, dragons! And as an afterthought, really nasty ones! You know how you can't really shout in a dream. This wasn't even waking up toothless, let alone the young warrior snoring peacefully unawares high above him. The dragons were horribly near, now flying in close formation, most unnatural behaviour for dragons. They were drawing down their legs and stretching out their talons, ready to strike. The warriors were totally helpless. They'd been killed inside their gaudy cocoons as they slept. Hiccup leant across to the small ledge in the cliff where he'd stowed his rucksack. Hands shaking, he drew out his bow and arrow from the quiver. Perhaps it was lucky that Hiccup was so far away, if he could see what the leader of the dragon pack was doing now, he might have fainted. but the leader was a tongue-twister dragon. Oh, they've got these really long tongues. Tongue-twister sounds like quite a sweet name for a dragon, but I'm afraid that tongue-twisters remove the limbs from their victims so that they can no longer run away. I'm sorry, but it's true. Yucky. Hovering perfectly still next to one of the hammocks, the tongue-twister slowly opened his mouth and out-flicked its tongue, a tongue thicker than a man's muscly arm. The forked ends of that tongue were flexible and delicate. The tongue slid inside one of the hammocks, the one belonging to Hiccup's unpleasant cousin Snotlout, and rummaged around as if looking for something. There, you see, there's Snotlout sleeping in his hammock, and there's the horrible tongue-twister dragon. Hiccup took careful... Oh, hang on. I missed something. Oh, yes. Careful aim. Oh, yes. He's got his bow and arrow. Hiccup took careful aim and fired the arrow. Of course, he was aiming at the tongue-twister. Hiccup wasn't that bad a marksman. Actually, not as good as he was at sword fighting, because Hiccup is a really good sword fighter, but not bad. But to do Hiccup justice, it is difficult to fire an arrow from a wobbling hammock, particularly when you are using a bow and arrow, both bent out of shape, ironically, by Snotlout himself. The slightly crooked arrow left the bow and spiralled upwards, weaving erratically in a drunken fashion. At the last minute, it plunged to the right, missed the dragon entirely, and sank into Snotlout's calf. It wasn't quite what Hiccup had intended, but it did have the desired effect, sort of. Snotlout let a small muffled scream, as you would, of course, if you'd just been shot in the leg by an arrow, and leapt out of the hammock, much to the surprise and annoyance of the tongue-twister, who hadn't yet got hold of one of Snotlout's limbs. Of course, in his half-asleep arrow-ridden instincts, Snotlout had completely forgotten he was 3/4 of the way up the cliff. Oh, dear. Oh, down he plunged, hurtling down that hysterical drop past the hammocks of his fellow warriors and past Hiccup himself, who reached out desperately to try and catch him, though Snotlout would have been far too heavy, and that would have been the end of Snotlout if there had not been a tree growing out of the cliff face not far below Hiccup. The tree broke Snotlout fall, and though he carried on downwards, he just managed to grab hold of one of the low-bended branches to save himself. So there was Snotlout, dangling from the tree, a 3,000-foot drop below him, so surprised that he too could not make a sound, staring up at Hiccup with round, terrified eyes. "Help me, you fool!" mouthed Snotlout graciously. Snotlout was not one for being polite, even when he had just been saved from a nasty fate at the tongue of a tongue-twister, and was still depending on the person he was insulting to save his life. He couldn't hold on for long, but it was slightly out of Hiccup's reach. Hiccup frantically scrambled around in the hammock, trying to get out one of his climbing ropes, so that Snotlout could grab onto it. But even at the best of times, manoeuvring inside a hammock is like trying to put your underpants on inside a pillowcase. And in this case, with the hammock fugged up with toothless smoke, it was like taking part in some bizarre sauna-like sweating ceremony. Back and forth, Hiccup struggled and swayed, but he couldn't find the end of the beastly climbing rope, and his hands were slippery with perspiration. He gave a frantic wriggle like a stranded worm and accidentally drew his sword instead of pulling out the climbing rope. With a dreadful ripping sound, the sword cut the old faded brown hammock right in half. Wow! Now at last he could find his voice. "Dragon attack!" It was an enormous shout, the full terrified blast of Hiccup's lunge, echoing off the dark walls of the cliff, sending the shout back again and on and up. A couple of feet away, Fishlegs caught the full blast of the shout and rocketed into wakefulness like an exploding starfish. He very nearly fell out of his hammock as well. Way up the cliff, every hammock wobbled and wiggled as its occupants blearily sat up, blurting, "What's that? What's going on?" "Eek!" squeaked Toothless in his arms, opening his eyes and pointing out his wings. Putting out his wings as he realised he was plummeting towards the ground. Oh my goodness. The dragons paused in their attack, hovering for a moment in the cold night air. They adjusted the lights in their yellow eyes, an extraordinary trick that some dragons possess, from a slight glow to a dazzling glare, and turned their heads downward and pinpointed Hiccup, swinging on the hammock remains, illuminating him in the dazzling brightness of their many searchlight eye beams. They're like torches, their eyes are like torches. So that, oh my goodness, so that he shone in brilliant detail against the darkness of the cliff. "Oh, no! Windbiker, wake up! Yelled Hiccup, waving his sword around wildly. He yelled this in Dragonese, for Hiccup was one of the few Vikings before or since who could speak this fascinating language. Snored the Windwalker. Still asleep. The swarm of dragons, eerily still hanging way above Hiccup, hissed with slow, chilling anger. Something in their eyes clicked. It was the little focus lid, a shutter that came down over their eyes, and enabled them to see objects pin-sharp from an extraordinary distance. They hung there for a moment more without moving, and only their eyes shifted a little, following the waving of Hiccup's sword. I think that's where we'll leave Hiccup, with the tongue twisters focusing in on him halfway up the cliff, middle of the night.